Hi, I'm Sebastian. I'm a co-founder at Stateful, and we make Runme. You can call me the notebooks guy because I'm going to talk about this a lot. And I want to show you guys sort of my journey getting into Dagger. And like maybe before I do that, the reason why I started looking into Dagger is sort of like two things. One, I think we would benefit from type safety and DevOps and in infrastructure. And I think like working towards sort of a component model, just like we've seen in other, areas like the web platform and all that, I think is like a net positive. But also, I'm not sure if you guys experience that every Monday, GitHub actions just get backed up and they fail and it's annoying. So I want a place where I can build, for example, this extension that we're looking at here in a way that I don't have to rely on GitHub, or I don't have to learn the YAML dialect, right? So I'm working through this process of porting everything, and then I kind of ran into some roadblocks where I just kind of wanted the experience to be different, right? So this is a mixture of the kind of tooling that I built for myself, and then I'm also kind of like trying to propose, sort of like a different approach of building pipelines using these notebooks that ultimately, serialize into Markdown, right? So Runme, without necessarily doing a lot of hand waving, is really like a notebook technology. It's a little bit like Jupyter, but it has sort of a cloud native bash kernel at the core. And that is like independent from the VS Code extension, but the best experience you get from the VS Code extension. And yeah, so this is a demo here. It's not the whole demo, so please don't pack up and leave yet. But the idea really is to break down your steps, like anything, workflows, pipelines, instructions into cells that just essentially like run sequentially, where you can obviously skip some. And that way you can kind of express documentation in a way and people can just run it, right? There's also a CLI, you can run it from the CLI too, but obviously you don't get the Dagger logo to render, you get a binary stream, right? Cool, so let's jump into the Dagger side of things. The reason why I call it cloud native kernel is because it understands resources, right? So when I, for example, use GCP, like I can also, and this is about to be released, we're still working on packaging it up, but in the next few weeks, it's going to go out. You can essentially inline, your cloud resources, right? And this is, for example, a list of instances that are running in GCP. Obviously, the same thing works for AWS, and you can conceivably have any sort of resource rendered in here. This is really just a web component at the end of the day. So working through, getting a little bit more familiar with like functions that I'm really excited about for that type safety reason. I kind of looked at it as like, hey, how do I build an experience that like supports me in building my module, which I think I have somewhere over here, and kind of gives me a little bit of like an IDE-like experience. And what I sort of like wound up with, and this is a prototype, so it's not available yet, but I do want to make it available, is like I have a little integration here. Let me move that bubble of faces that essentially still uses the CLI, but it gives me a higher level experience that wraps around, or like, I guess, transcends the CLI. So when this finishes running, and I hope it's not going to take forever, because sometimes when I run modules, then it skips the caching. So we might have to wait a sec here. But essentially what's going to happen is this is running the CLI. I slightly modified it based on a PR that was already open that I linked somewhere in here, but I can't find it right now. And it outputs, like a JSON blob of the type that is being produced here, right? For example, in this case, it's file. So I think at around the 50-second mark, it should finish. And then where you see the sort of like active state, you'll see a couple of buttons show up. So maybe, I don't have a drum roll right now, but let's hope we actually get to that 60-second mark. Come on, maybe this one is going to run faster. Yeah, I still have to figure out why when I work with modules, it's probably because I'm developing. Oh, here we go. This worked fastest. So essentially, what's happening here is that the notebook runs the CLI, but it intercepts the standard out. The standard error will still be written to a terminal. So this is just a fully functional terminal here. But then in the background, the notebook will realize, oh, okay, this returned a container, and then gives me the options that otherwise, I could look up with like -- help here, right? But like I can just click on, and I'm also going to get the information, the values that are already available, just displayed right here, right? So what I again can do, for example, I can click terminal, it inserts a new cell, and this is not as cool as Andrea's demo, but almost. So almost there, you get into the terminal, right? And you can do call say hi Dagger nods, right? And if you exit out of it, this just runs like a regular cell. Yeah, and so the idea here really is, oh yeah, this finished now too. Oh, actually it didn't. Oh yeah, this is just being slow, it just skips the cache. But yeah, the idea really is, at the end of the day, when I now save this document and I look at it in a vanilla, I guess text view, this is really just Markdown. If I use VS Code's render, it will really just look like a Markdown document, right? But it does have that sort of like IDE-like experience built in. And there's a bunch of magic under the hood that I'm not going to go into because Runme controls how processes are being run. So we can separate standard out, standard error in before it hits the terminal and do some stuff with it. And then in this sort of managed environment store down here, you can see how it doesn't really intercept, but like it sticks new environment variables into my environment that I then later can also use, right? So for example, you can see this blob that I was talking about that looks something like this, right? This is being used to render what's on here, right? So that's just something that I'm currently experimenting with, and I kind of want feedback from you guys and from the community. But ultimately, it's basically like a higher level integration to make Runme and the notebook UX more useful with Dagger. So that's one part of my demo. The second part is what I kind of want to get to is when I write my index, and I write my module over here. So the extension that we're currently looking at, it has like this Golang binary, this kernel, a notebook kernel that runs inside of the extension, but it's separate, right? So when I build the extension, I need to build that kernel. I need to build it for Linux, Darwin, all the platforms, and then package it all together. And that's why my pipeline in GitHub doesn't look to be trivial. It's kind of like fairly complex, right? And what I really want to do is I want to build a module that lives in that code base, which is TypeScript, and I want to build one that lives in the Golang side that builds the binary, right? Or even download pre-built binaries, depending on the scenario. So what I really want to get to is that, instead of, I'm just going to run these now, hopefully they won't take as long, that I can, essentially run these, either as standalone functions or functions that call into my module, but then, composing the whole pipeline that puts together the extension with the right binary of the kernel and all that. I don't want to necessarily, encode into the module, right? Because then it's fixed, right? And I know there are ways to, parameterize that and make it a little bit more flexible. What I really want to do at the end of the day is, we'll just let those keep running, is to use those references, right? Because as I showed you with this managed environment, I do have references, from previous builds. So I assume, and this is where, the engine is not, I don't understand enough about it, but I would hope that if there's something in the cache that I can reference, if I have one cell built the binary, that my extension can reference that cell, right? And, in my integration, I made it so that when cells finish, they also create a new environment variable that just has the ID in it, right? And this unfortunately doesn't work yet, but I know there's some work going on. I found out on Discord that hopefully will enable that I can take these IDs and stick them into the CLI, right? So instead of saying, there's a host, a file that I built on my host from a previous function call, and I have to string it through the host, I could just hand over the reference, right? Whether then it builds it just in time or it goes into the cache, I hopefully wouldn't have to worry about because the engine does that. But the idea really would be then to stick them into the module call, right? So I can have 3 cells that build the individual artifacts, or at least have the description how to do that in a functional way, and then these outputs become this thing's input here. When I run this, I get this lazy blob, cache error, tried to debug it a little bit, but then kind of gave up because I don't know all the internals. But how I would really want this to look like is something like this, right? Or something of that sort, where you then put these IDs into the CLI at the end of the day. I wish this could have worked. I found a simple case where it worked and then assumed it would, and then when I put all the pieces together last night, it didn't. But I want to use this as an impetus to lobby that we can make it work, right? And I know this might not be fantastic with type safety, but in a way, I mean, there's a lot of magical things that this notebook UI could do, right? And before I sort of get to the end of my presentation, the one thing that like, you can also do in case you really don't like, like a notebook UX is like, run this whole thing using a, what is it, notebook? What is the file? Pipeline. And, you can do a run all and skip prompts. And, you can still run your, your pipeline, like as if you were running it without the notebook, right? So this is me making a little bit of the case of like, it's not crazy to run, JSON and YAML. Why is it crazy to run Markdown? Because you kind of get the benefit of both worlds. And here you can see, how both the standard error and the standard out hits the terminal, right? Which the notebook intercepts and sort of like hides away from you, because it's not meant to be for humans, it's for machines, right? And just as a closing, note here too is like, if you don't like VS Code, that's fine. You can run this as a web app. I have it right here, where you can run it in code spaces. You can run it basically anything that is based on the VS Code platform, like Google IDX, and there's like Gitpod, there's like a lot of those, right? So yeah, that's kind of like my presentation.